February 3, 1944. The waters of the East China Sea shimmer under a pale winter sun, their surface broken only by the steady wake of two oil tankers. Cutting through the waves, the Goyo Maru and Ariake Maru, heavy with precious crude oil from the Dutch East Indies, steam homeward toward a fuel-starved Japan. Their engines throb with mechanical certainty, their hulls pregnant with the lifeblood of empire. Behind them, the escort frigate Sato maintains vigilant watch, her crew scanning horizons that seem empty of threat. The air carries the salt tang of sea spray and the acrid smell of burning coal, mingling with the quiet confidence of men who believe themselves masters of these waters. But beneath the surface, unseen and unheard death moves with terrible patience. The empire of the rising sun had entered the Pacific. War with supreme confidence in its naval supremacy, built upon the glorious victories at Tsushima and the Yellow Sea. Japanese admirals, steeped in the traditions of decisive fleet engagements, had planned for a war of battleships and aircraft carriers of honor and glory on the open ocean. They possessed the largest merchant fleet in the world, 63 million gross tons of shipping capacity distributed across 2529 vessels. Their naval strategists had calculated probable wartime losses with mathematical precision, perhaps 800,000 to 11 million gross tons in the first year, tapering to 700,000 gross tons annually thereafter. These estimates, based on World War I data, seemed conservative and manageable. After all, Japan's island chains formed natural barriers. Her naval bases extended across the Pacific like an iron curtain, and her submarine detection capabilities, though limited, appeared adequate for the task ahead. The Imperial Japanese Navy had allocated its resources according to this vision of warfare. At the Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, 10 officers labored over combined fleet operations, while a single officer handled the entire responsibility for rear-line defense, including the protection of Japan's vital sea communications. The message was clear: merchant shipping protection remained a secondary concern, a defensive afterthought in a navy obsessed with offensive action. Japanese naval doctrine, forged in the crucible of surface battles against Chinese and Russian fleets, had evolved into an almost mystical belief in the decisive engagement, the single climactic battle that would shatter enemy resolve and secure victory. This philosophical framework blinded Japanese leadership to a fundamental truth in modern industrial warfare. Victory belonged not to the side with the most glorious battles, but to the nation that could sustain its war machine longest. While Japanese admirals dreamed of Pearl Harbor-style strikes and carrier duels, American submarine commanders were quietly studying a different kind of warfare altogether: the patient, methodical strangulation of an island empire's supply lines. The first American submarines to prowl Japanese waters in December 1941 carried more than torpedoes in their tubes. They bore the industrial might of a continent. Yet these early war patrols achieved little, hampered by the catastrophic failures of the Mark 14 torpedo. For nearly 2 years, American submarine crews would fire their weapons at point-blank range into Japanese ships, only to watch in helpless fury as torpedoes ran too deep, exploded prematurely, or failed to detonate at all. Japanese merchant captains reported entering ports with unexploded American torpedoes embedded in their hulls like metallic tumors. Some began to believe with dangerous confidence that American submarines posed little real threat, but in the sprawling industrial complexes of Pennsylvania and Connecticut, in the research laboratories of the Naval Torpedo Station, American engineers labored with grim determination to solve the torpedo crisis. By August 1943, the problems had been systematically identified and corrected. The Mark 14's magnetic exploder was replaced with a more reliable contact detonator. Depth control mechanisms were recalibrated. Quality control procedures were revolutionized. Most importantly, American submarine production had reached full capacity. By 1943, new fleet submarines emerged from shipyards. Monthly, each one a floating death machine crewed by increasingly experienced hunters. The transformation was swift and merciless. In 1942, American submarines had sunk 139 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 560,000 tons in 1943. This figure exploded to 305 vessels and 1,335 million tons, but 1944 would witness carnage beyond Japanese comprehension. 565 merchant ships totaling 248 million tons sent to the bottom. The submarine had evolved from nuisance to nemesis, from a tactical irritant to a strategic weapon of empire. Destroying power for Japanese naval commanders. The realization came with the stunning suddenness of a torpedo detonation. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff, found himself locked in heated discussion with his Army counterpart in September 1943. The statistics spread before them told a story of catastrophic loss. Japanese merchant tonnage had dropped from 63 million gross tons to 556 million tons, with civil-controlled shipping, the economic lifeblood of the nation, reduced to just 269 million tons. The pre-war promise to maintain 3 million tons for civilian use had been shattered like glass against the rocks of submarine warfare. Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, veteran of Japan's surface battles and former Navy minister, received his appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the newly created Grand Escort Command Headquarters in November 1943. His mandate was clear: save what remained of Japan's merchant fleet. Yet the forces placed under his command reflected the Navy's continued bias toward offensive operations. He controlled fewer than 50 escort vessels of 800 tons or larger, including converted gunboats and destroyers so obsolete they could barely manage ocean voyages. The best of his escort ships consisted of 15 destroyers built in the 1920s, antiquated vessels. Facing the most advanced submarines in the world, the cultural shock ran deeper than mere tactical surprise. Japanese naval tradition venerated the warrior spirit, the bold stroke, the decisive action that would crush enemies through superior will and superior valor. Convoy escort duty offered none of these satisfactions. It demanded the patience of a guardian, the vigilance of a shepherd, the unglamorous persistence that Japanese naval culture had spent 50 years learning to despise. Young officers who dreamed of commanding battleships in fleet engagements found themselves assigned to rusting frigates tasked with the prosaic duty of shepherding cargo vessels through submarine-infested waters. American submarine campaign embodied everything Japanese naval philosophy rejected. It was patient where Japan valued speed, methodical where Japan prized inspiration, anonymous where Japan celebrated individual heroism. American submarine commanders did not seek glorious battle. They sought shipping tonnage. They avoided contact with enemy warships not from cowardice, but from professional calculation. Every torpedo wasted on a destroyer was one less torpedo available for a tanker. This utilitarian approach to warfare struck at the very foundations of Japanese military thought. By February 1944, as the Goyo Maru and Ariake Maru approached their fatal rendezvous in the East China Sea, the scope of Japan's strategic blindness had become undeniable. American submarines operated with near impunity in waters that Japanese charts marked as secure. The single escort frigate Sato represented the maximum protection Japan could afford for two of its most valuable vessels. When the submarine struck, the Sato's crew found themselves spectators to slaughter, able only to rescue survivors from ships they could not protect. The symbolic power of this moment cannot be overstated. Here in microcosm was the entire Pacific War. Japanese industrial capacity painfully gathered from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia, destroyed by American technology and American persistence. The oil that might have fueled Japanese aircraft or warships instead spread across the surface of the East China Sea in a rainbow slick that marked another victory for submarine warfare over surface tradition. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most perceptive naval strategist, had once warned that Japan could run wild for perhaps 6 to 12 months before American industrial might asserted itself. He had not anticipated that the assertion would come not through massive fleet engagements, but through the patient work of submarines, picking apart Japan's supply lines like vultures cleaning a carcass. By 1944, Yamamoto was dead killed by American fighters who had intercepted his transport through signals intelligence. Another example of American technological and methodical superiority over Japanese tactical brilliance. The submarine campaign achieved what no surface fleet could have accomplished: the systematic dismantling of Japan's capacity to wage war. Every tanker sent to the bottom represented not just lost fuel, but lost industrial capacity, lost transportation capability, lost strategic flexibility. Every cargo vessel destroyed meant raw materials that would never reach Japanese factories, food that would never feed Japanese workers, ammunition that would never arm Japanese soldiers. Cumulative effect created a cascade of industrial failure that reached into every corner of Japanese society. The sinking of the Goyo Maru and Ariake Maru in February 1944 marked a turning point in Japanese naval thinking, forcing even the most tradition-bound officers to acknowledge the reality of submarine warfare. Within weeks, Captain Atsushi Oi, operations officer for the Grand Escort Command, proposed the adoption of large convoy tactics, formations of 15 to 20 ships protected by multiple escorts. By American and British standards, these remained pathetically small Atlantic convoys routinely included 70 vessels or more. But for Japan, accustomed to two-ship convoys with single escorts, the proposal represented a revolutionary acknowledgement that defensive warfare demanded resources and attention. Even this belated recognition came too late, and with too little. The Grand Escort Command struggled with obsolete equipment, undertrained personnel, and the persistent hostility of a naval establishment that viewed convoy duty as a career dead end. Communication systems remained primitive and incompatible. Between ships, radar installations proceeded at glacial pace. Most critically, the best escort vessels continued to be diverted to combined fleet operations, leaving merchant protection to the oldest and least capable ships in the Navy. The American submarine offensive represented more than military strategy. It embodied a fundamental difference in national character and industrial philosophy. American submarines carried not just torpedoes, but the products of mass production, standardized training, and systematic problem solving. Each submarine represented thousands of hours of industrial labor, spread across dozens of specialized factories and coordinated through bureaucratic mechanisms that Japanese industry could never match. The torpedoes themselves, once the problems were solved, became symbols of American technical superiority, precision instruments that found their targets with mechanical reliability. Japanese naval construction, by contrast, remained trapped in an artisanal mindset that prized individual craftsmanship over mass production. The Yamato-class battleships, with their hand-fitted armor and custom manufactured components, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, yet these magnificent vessels consumed resources equivalent to dozens of escort ships, and their combat effectiveness proved negligible against an enemy that avoided surface engagement altogether. The Yamato herself would meet her end in April 1945, sent on a suicide mission against American invasion forces, a final futile gesture that epitomized Japan's strategic confusion. Cascading effects of submarine warfare reached far beyond military considerations. By 1944, Japanese civilians faced severe shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials. Industrial production declined precipitously as factories lacked the coal, oil, and metal necessary for operation. The government's promise to maintain 3 million gross tons of shipping for civilian use had been abandoned by war's end. Civilian-controlled tonnage would drop below 1 million tons. The submarine campaign had achieved what strategic bombing and surface engagements could not: the systematic destruction of Japan's capacity to sustain modern industrial society. The human cost of this naval failure extended beyond the approximately $6,700 Japanese merchant mariners who died in submarine attacks. Malnutrition spread throughout the Japanese home islands as food imports dwindled. Industrial workers faced unemployment. As factories closed for lack of raw materials, military units throughout the Pacific found themselves stranded without supplies, reduced to subsistence existence on isolated islands. The submarine campaign had transformed the entire Japanese empire into a collection of besieged fortresses, each one slowly starving for want of supplies that would never arrive. American submarine commanders prosecuted their campaign with methodical thoroughness that reflected broader cultural attitudes toward technology and efficiency. They maintained detailed records of shipping sunk routes, disrupted, and strategic effects achieved. They coordinated their operations through sophisticated communication networks that allowed real-time adjustment of tactics and targeting priorities. They treated submarine warfare not as a romantic adventure, but as an industrial process measurable in tonnage. Destroyed and supply lines severed. The contrast with Japanese naval culture could not have been starker. Japanese naval records from the period reveal an organization struggling to comprehend the nature of the threat it faced. Reports spoke of individual acts of heroism of escort captains who died at their posts, of merchant crews who continued their duties despite overwhelming odds, but they revealed little systematic analysis of the submarine threat or comprehensive planning for countermeasures. The Grand Escort Command, created in desperation in November 1943, represented an admission of failure. Rather than a proactive response to a recognized problem, the cultural symbolism embedded in submarine warfare extended to the weapons themselves. American torpedoes, once perfected, became emblems of industrial precision and technological sophistication. They carried not just explosive warheads, but the accumulated expertise of American engineering, the systematic methods of American problem-solving, and the relentless pursuit of efficiency that characterized American industrial culture. Each successful torpedo attack represented a victory not just of one weapon system over another, but of one approach to technological development over another. Japanese anti-submarine weapons, by contrast, reflected the limitations of a naval establishment unprepared for defensive warfare. Depth charges were frequently set too shallow, reflecting inadequate understanding of submarine operating procedures. Sonar equipment remained primitive and unreliable. Most critically, Japanese anti-submarine tactics remained trapped in World War I. Concepts emphasizing individual ship actions rather than coordinated group responses. The result was a series of isolated engagements in which Japanese escorts found themselves overwhelmed by submarines that could dictate the terms of combat. The strategic implications of submarine warfare reached beyond immediate military considerations to fundamental questions of national survival. Japan's pre-war leaders had gambled the nation's future on their ability to secure and defend a vast Pacific empire through superior naval power. The submarine campaign revealed the impossibility of this vision. No surface fleet, however powerful, could defend the thousands of miles of sea lanes necessary to sustain an island empire. The geography that had once protected Japan from invasion now became a trap, isolating the home islands from the resources necessary for continued resistance. By late 1944, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the submarine campaign had achieved its strategic objectives. Japanese merchant tonnage had been reduced to approximately 2 million tons, barely sufficient to meet the food requirements of the civilian population. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of pre-war levels. Military units throughout the Pacific had been effectively isolated from resupply and reinforcement. The submarine had accomplished what centuries of isolation had prevented: the complete severance of Japan's connection to the outside world. Final irony of Japan's submarine warfare failure lay in the nation's own submarine capabilities. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed a substantial submarine force, including some of the world's largest and most sophisticated underwater vessels. Yet, These submarines were employed primarily in support of fleet operations tasked with reconnaissance and attack against enemy warships rather than merchant shipping. Japanese submarine commanders trained in the traditions of naval combat viewed attacks against unarmed cargo vessels as beneath their dignity. This cultural bias prevented Japan from implementing against Allied shipping the same tactics that American submarines employed so effectively against Japanese commerce. The lesson was clear, though it came too late for Japan to benefit from it. Modern warfare belonged to the nation that could sustain its industrial and logistical base longest. Surface battles might capture headlines and satisfy traditional concepts of naval honor, but submarine warfare determined the outcome of campaigns. The patient hunter beneath the waves had proven more decisive than the proud warrior on the bridge of a battleship. American submarines had cut more than supply lines they had severed. The connection between Japanese strategic ambitions and Japanese strategic capabilities. In the closing months of the Pacific War, as Japan's leaders contemplated surrender, the submarine campaign stood as perhaps the most decisive single factor in their defeat. Not the atomic bombs devastating, though they were not the Soviet entry into the war catastrophic though its implications might be, but the slow, methodical destruction of Japan's capacity to function as a modern industrial nation. The submarine had achieved what no surface fleet could accomplish: the transformation of Japan from a maritime empire into an isolated, starving island nation. The ghost of the Goyo Maru and Ariake Maru haunted Japanese naval planning through the war's final months. Every convoy that sailed faced the prospect of similar destruction. Every cargo vessel that reached port did so only through luck or American inattention. The seas that had once carried Japan's imperial ambitions now bore only the flotsam of a dying empire. Oil slicks marking the graves of tankers, debris fields where cargo ships had disappeared, life rafts carrying the survivors of a naval strategy that had failed to comprehend the nature of modern warfare. American submarine campaign in the Pacific represented more than a tactical victory. It embodied a philosophical triumph of systematic method over individual heroism, of industrial efficiency over artisanal craftsmanship, of patient strategy over impulsive action. The submarines themselves became symbols of American abundance. Each torpedo represented resources that Japan could never match, industrial capacity that Japan could never hope to equal, technological sophistication that Japan could never attain. In the end, the submarines had accomplished what surface fleets could not. They had made Japan's dreams of empire logistically impossible. The rising sun had set beneath the waves, extinguished not by dramatic battles, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small victories, each one measured in tons of shipping sent to the bottom, each one bringing Japan closer to the moment when continued resistance would become impossible. The Pacific War's greatest irony lay in its resolution through the most prosaic of military activities: the protection and destruction of merchant shipping. The decisive weapon proved to be not the aircraft carrier or the battleship, but the submarine, patient, methodical, and utterly effective. In the spaces between the waves and the silence beneath the surface, American submarines had written the true history of the Pacific War, one sinking at a time, until Japan's capacity for resistance had been reduced to nothing more than the will to continue a struggle that logistics had already decided. Submarine campaign stands as a testament to the power of sustained, systematic pressure over dramatic but isolated victories. Like water wearing away stone, American submarines had eroded Japan's strategic position through constant methodical application of force against the most vulnerable points of an overextended empire. They had proven that in modern war, the destruction of an enemy's capacity to fight could be more decisive than the destruction of his will to fight. The echoes of this campaign would resonate far beyond the Pacific War, influencing naval strategy and national security planning for generations to come. The submarine had emerged as the ultimate expression of industrial age warfare, sophisticated, efficient, and utterly ruthless in its pursuit of strategic objectives. It had demonstrated that control of the sea belonged not to the nation with the most powerful surface fleet, but to the nation that could most effectively disrupt its enemies' use of the ocean highways in the depths of the Pacific, where the wrecks of Japanese merchantmen rest in eternal silence lies the true monument to American submarine warfare, not glory or honor, but the systematic application of industrial power to strategic ends. The submarines had cut more than supply lines, they had severed the connections that bound Japan's empire together, leaving only isolated fragments of a dream that could no longer sustain itself against the relentless pressure of a more modern, more efficient, and ultimately more ruthless approach to the business of war. The final accounting of the submarine campaign reveals numbers that speak to the magnitude of Japan's strategic failure. 1314. Ships sunk 53 million tons of shipping, destroyed 546% of all Japanese naval and merchant losses attributed to submarine action. Behind these statistics lay the collapse of an empire and the vindication of a new form of warfare that would reshape naval strategy for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.